And there you have deep historical and literary learning combined with gross cultural generalizations about people. Steven Pinker, the famous Harvard psychologist, best-selling author.
Thank you. And can we have these slides, please? I'm going to be speaking this morning about objective flourishing and subjective happiness, answering the question, is it really true that everything's amazing and no one's happy? All people who have analyzed human well-being agree that it has multiple dimensions. We can begin by distinguishing objective well-being, which we can call flourishing, from subjective well-being or happiness. So objective well-being would consist of conditions like life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, things that we can pretty much agree are human goods, whether or not people appreciate them when they have them. That can be distinguished from subjective well-being or happiness, which itself can be divided into two dimensions, experiential or emotional well-being. That is the balance between positive emotions such as elation, joy, and delight versus negative emotions like worry, anger, and sadness. That can be distinguished from evaluative or cognitive well-being or happiness. The answer that people give to questions like how satisfied are you in general or all things being considered or these days, or where do you stand on a ladder from the worst possible life to the best possible life. Now, these are conceptually different, and you can just imagine, for example, a person living in rather miserable objective circumstances. They may die in their 40s, they may have suffered the loss of a child, they may be malnourished, but they are grateful for small mercies and might have a dispositionally upbeat temperament. You can also imagine a citizen of a first world country who doesn't appreciate his good fortune and is a morose sad sack despite everything going well. A question, has objective well-being increased over time? Excuse me. I have tried to answer that question in my book Enlightenment Now in the form of 75 graphs that try to plot measures of objective well-being over time. Let me give you the message of the book in a nutshell, which is that objective well-being has increased massively over the last 250 years, beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. Life expectancy at birth in most human societies throughout most of history is about 30 years. Today it is more than 70 years. Life expectancy is longest in wealthy parts of the world like Europe and the Americas, but it has been soaring in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa as well. And this is a general pattern that we'll see in measures of objective well-being, that while the developed West was the first to make the great escape from universal poverty and deprivation, in the last 50 years, the rest of the world has been rapidly catching up. Child mortality for most of human history, about 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday, such as Sweden 250 years ago. That was brought down by a factor of 100, and other parts of the world, such as Canada, South Korea, Chile, and Ethiopia, have followed suit. Mothers used to be vulnerable to death in childbirth as well. About 1% of Swedish mothers about 250 years ago. That was brought down by a factor of 300. Likewise, in other parts of the world, United States, Malaysia, Ethiopia. Sustenance. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and through most of human history, societies were not able to grow enough calories to feed their population. That is no longer the case in most parts of the world. Undernourishment, which afflicted about 1/3 of people in the developing world 50 years ago, has fallen to less than 15%. And famines, which used to strike any part of the world and wreak enormous devastation and misery, now take place only in remote and war-torn parts of the world, where the problem is not an inability to grow enough food, but to get it to the people who need it. Prosperity. For most of human history, economic growth pretty much did not exist. As this graph, which plots the gross world product from the year 1 to the present shows, for about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. Then with the Industrial Revolution, it has increased by a factor of about 200. This would mean nothing if all of the gains went to the proverbial 1%, but in fact, it has decimated the rate of extreme poverty, which 200 years ago pertained to about 90% of the world's population. Today, it applies to 9%. Within wealthy countries, even though inequality has increased, so has redistribution massively. 150 years ago, wealthy countries redistributed about 1.5% of their GDP to children, the sick, the poor, and the elderly. Today, every developed country devotes between 20 and 30% of its GDP to social transfers. Peace, the natural state of relations between empires and states for most of human history, was war, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. It was thought when I was growing up that this situation would only get worse because of the 2 massive spikes of bloodletting corresponding to the 2 world wars. But contrary to the predictions that I grew up with, that World War III was just a matter of time, we now know that the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union went out of existence, and World War III never happened. In fact, if we zoom in on the period since the end of the Second World War, we see there's been an uneven but unmistakable decline in the rate of deaths from all wars, from about 20 per 100,000 per year to less than 1 per 100,000 per year. Freedom and rights. We've all read with alarm about the erosion of democracy in countries like Turkey and Venezuela and Hungary and Russia. Nonetheless, if you add up all the countries that are democratic and autocratic, scaled by how democratic and how autocratic they are, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in the last decade. That a majority of people live in countries that are more democratic than autocratic, and a majority of countries are more democratic than autocratic. Lest this seem impossible to believe, just think back to the 1970s when I was a college student. I scarcely have to remind people in this part of the world that half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, living under Soviet totalitarian dictatorships. Most of Latin America was under the control of right-wing military governments. Spain and Portugal were literally under the control of fascist governments. Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, all of them democratic today. Violent crime. There's been a massive decline in the rate of the most violent wealthy democracy, the United States, since 1990, and the world as a whole has seen its rate of homicide go down by about 30% in the last 20 years. Not just homicide, but violence against women has been in decline. These are data from the United States. Both domestic violence against wives and girlfriends and rates of rape and sexual assault have plummeted over the last 40 years. Knowledge, the natural state of humankind is ignorance and illiteracy. In the early modern period, about 15% of Europeans could read and write. That has increased to universal literacy by the early 20th century, and again, the rest of the world is rapidly catching up. About 80% of the world can read and write now, 90% of people under the age of 25. And the rate of getting a basic education has also increased. About 80% of people in the world have a basic education. Does this affect the quality of life? Well, in many ways, these developments have. For example, the average work week in the United States and Europe has fallen from more than 62 hours 150 years ago to less than 40 hours today. And thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity in the West, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our time, of our lives that we forfeit to housework, which people identify as their least favorite way of spending their time, has fallen from 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. But does it make us any happier? According to a certain conventional wisdom, it does not. That all of these gains are unappreciated, we pocket our good fortune, we return to an innate baseline, and we are no happier than we were before. As it's said in the popular meme, everything's amazing and no one's happy. I will quote from an American comedian who I will not name, but the routine is too apposite to ignore. We live in an amazing world, and it's wasted on the crappiest generation of spoiled idiots. Flying is the worst. People come back from flights and they tell you their story. It was the worst day of my life. We get on the plane and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. Oh, really? Then what happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly, like a bird? Did you soar into the clouds? Impossibly. Did you partake in the miracle of human flight and then land softly on giant tires that you couldn't even conceive how they fucking put air in them? You're sitting in a chair in the sky. You're a Greek myth. People say there are delays, air travel's too slow, New York to California in 5 hours. That used to take 30 years. So the question is, with all of these advances in objective well-being, has there been a flatlining of subjective well-being, of happiness? Now, there are few longitudinal data that allow us to answer this question. We certainly can't answer it over the course of 250 years. The data that go back the longest are for the United States, which is something of an outlier. But there are at least reasons to expect that subjective well-being has increased. A robust finding from happyology, the scientific study of happiness, is that happiness is correlated with freedom, and as I've mentioned, freedom has increased. And happiness is correlated with prosperity, and prosperity has increased. Just to show you how strong that relationship is, these are data from Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. If you plot people's self-rated life satisfaction against their country's GDP per capita, there's a strong curvilinear relationship. These data are shown on logarithmic coordinates. So an extra dollar makes a poor person much happier than a rich person. But nonetheless, it holds across the scale. And it holds not only in comparisons between rich countries and poor countries, indicated by the scatter of dots on the graph, with the rich countries on the right, poor countries on the left, but it holds among the citizens within each country, as seen by the regression line shown by the arrow that impales each dot. So richer people are happier, people in richer countries are happier. One would therefore expect that since the world has gotten richer, its citizens ought to have gotten happier. Again, we don't have data that directly test this, this prediction, but we do know that for the countries for which we have data, in 70% of them, happiness has increased over time. These are data just from the last 25 years or so. As you can see, the United States is not one of them. It has declined somewhat, but a majority of countries have increased in happiness. Let me show you the data for Ukraine, which showed a spectacular increase in happiness until just before 2010, followed by a decline, and it's not a big surprise why that should have happened. We do not have, I don't have data, at least since 2014. One of the reasons for this discrepancy between the conventional wisdom that happiness has not increased and the fact that in most countries it has is that there's a widespread illusion that people are less happy than they really are. 150 years ago, Ralph Waldo Emerson famously said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Now, how a recluse living in a cabin on a pond could know this was never made clear, but the survey data suggests that Emerson was mistaken, that in fact the mass of men are actually, and women are more happy than unhappy. Pollsters call this the Optimism Gap. It is a massive phenomenon. This graph plots the share of population that people think are happy for each country against the share of the population that actually are happy. If people were accurate in their assessments of other people, the dots would fall along the diagonal. The fact that they all cluster in the lower right quadrant shows that universally, people think that their countrymen are less happy than they actually are. It's a puzzle. I don't think anyone knows why there is such a big optimism gap, but I suggest that portrayals of the country through journalism and the media must play a role, owing to the very nature of news. News is about stuff that happens, not stuff that doesn't happen. And most things that happen are things that go wrong. A terrorist attack, an epidemic, an explosion, a rampage shooting. Good things tend to creep up a few percentage points at a time, which can compound over time, but they don't happen on a Thursday in October that can be reported as a headline. Also, there is a well-documented negativity bias among journalists, captured in this satirical page from the humor newspaper, The Onion. CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. There's also a negativity bias just built into our own psychology, our own wiring. We think about and feel bad events more than good events, especially recent bad events. For events that took place a while ago, we don't forget them, but we forget how bad they were at the time. Explaining an observation from Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. So in sum, objective well-being must be distinguished from subjective well-being or happiness. People can be better off and not appreciate their good fortune. Objectively, well-being has increased massively almost everywhere. Subjectively, less clear. On average, yes. Not everywhere, but still more than most people think. Thank you.
Stephen, come and sit for a second because we have a few minutes. So let me, I think that we'll
certainly can't look at say that the glass is half full or half empty.
Let me ask you one way of getting at the puzzle you raise, which is objective conditions have improved, but how do people view it subjectively, is to ask you a question about the institution you're at, Harvard. So you would assume that people who get admitted to Harvard are essentially the luckiest people in the world, because at this point they know that they are going to get good jobs, they're going to have good careers, they have gotten the stamp of Harvard University on them for the rest of their lives. 25% of Harvard undergraduates report that they are depressed. That is 5 times higher than the national average. And it embodies this puzzle, I suppose, and I ask you this because you're at Harvard, you teach these people. Why are they unhappy?
Yes. A lot of them do feel under constant pressure. Ironically, the time pressure, that they're all crazy busy. Why are they so busy? Is it because they're cramming for exams, that, excuse me, that they're in the lab curing diseases, that they're in the library researching great works of Western civilization? No, they're all involved in so many extracurriculars to be embedded in social networks that they barely have time to have a relaxed social life. They're singing in the choir, they're pulling an oar on the sports team, they're writing for the campus paper, and they're taking a course load. But it's ironically, it isn't so much the academic demands, but it's the extracurricular ones, because of the demand that they live up to some crazy standard of a well-rounded person.
And finally, if everyone is so happy, why are they voting for what seem to be very unhappy people all over the world? People like Trump seem unhappy about the state of the world, promising in some way to remedy it. It doesn't seem consistent with your idea that everyone is happy and content.
Well, it's not everyone is happy and content. Certainly everyone is better off. They often don't appreciate it. In the United States is always a strange case, because among developed countries, it is something of an outlier. It's pretty happy, but it's not in the top 10. It's certainly not in the top 10 in terms of safety, in terms of health. Just about any measure of objective well-being and subjective well-being, the United States punches below its wealth. And I think there's a lot of, there are You can speculate endlessly about American exceptionalism, but it is not a representative of what happens, I think, as countries develop. It almost is, but I think it's the countries like Finland, like Estonia, perhaps like Ukraine in the future, that represent the direction of human progress.
Steven Pinker, pleasure to have you. Thank you. So there you have it, according to Neil Ferguson.